31C. Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, here we are again. 648 days since the Environment Bill was first introduced to Parliament, and we're still here debating it, trying to get bolder action from ministers on the environment, on climate and nature. And ministers, I'm afraid, still dragging their heels in not introducing the bold action that we need, in particular against the routine discharge of raw sewage into rivers. Still favouring a weaker watchdog than they should be. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the middle of a climate and ecological crisis, and at the very time the UK is hosting COP26, this is generational injustice in action. We need to see bolder action. There was no mention from the Chancellor in the budget of climate or nature. In fact, there was cuts to domestic flying, coupled with the Prime Minister flying from Glasgow to London on a private jet. I'm sure the Minister would have joined me on the train when we came back from COP, travelling by train rather than flying, and the Prime Minister should have done so as well. It is a wrong, bad, outdated message to say, do as I say, don't do as I do, but I'm afraid that is what we are used to. It sets an appalling example for the world that the Prime Minister didn't take the train instead of taking the plane. And it will be up to it's up to us here to sort that out. Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain is again the dirty man of Europe. Not one English river is in a healthy condition, with not one meeting good chemical standards. Happy giving way.
I'm grateful for him giving way. He'll no doubt be aware that I am seeking water bathing status for the Thames along Port Meadow. And one of the reasons why that's so important is because of the dire state that our rivers are in. None of them are chemically sound. And what my constituents have reported as illness that they've had when they've just wanted to get into the river for their minds and bodies has been atrocious. Would he agree with me that this is a national issue that is not being addressed adequately by these amendments, and we need to go further?
Well, I thank the honourable member for her intervention. As a keen wild swimmer myself, I want to see bathing water quality in our rivers massively improve, not just for swimmers, but for the natural world as well, and so I would support her in those efforts. But we don't have good enough water quality in our rivers in England. In the last year alone, raw sewage was discharged into UK rivers and seas over 400,000 times. And the government's response, whipping their MPs to vote against an amendment that would have stopped raw human sewage pouring into our precious rivers and seas. I'm afraid the message that was sent from that vote was a poor one. Then came the rightful public outcry that shamed the government into a U-turn after days of digging their heels in. They've now adopted much of the amendment they voted against, and that is welcome, but they have not adopted all of it. I'd like to thank the Minister and the Secretary of State for their time in speaking to the opposition about this. I'm grateful for some of the words that the Minister has said today that put on record some of the concerns raised by the opposition. But I have to say to her, publishing an amendment at 5 p.m. last Friday did not really build trust. It didn't build trust in those on both sides who want to see the detail, nor from the stakeholders that were looking forward to scrutinising carefully what the Minister has to say.
Will my honourable friend give way on that very
Happy to.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend for giving way. I think he is making an excellent point. The issue of trust is paramount here. There are communities up and down the great rivers of the country, as my honourable friend from Abingdon mentioned earlier, and obviously Reading is downstream from Abingdon. London is further downstream. We're all deeply concerned about the state of our rivers and the way the government has behaved. Whilst it has given some concessions, it's listened to some extent, still leaves a lot to be desired, and the public remain deeply concerned about this issue.
Well, I thank one more friend for that intervention, and I believe the public are seriously concerned about what has happened in the House over the past few weeks. They've been alerted and awakened to the volume of raw sewage being discharged into the rivers and their seas, and they want to see faster and bolder action from ministers now they are aware of this absolute outrage in our environment. And that's why we do need to build trust again on this issue. The Minister cited the figures of over £600 billion in her remarks now and remarks before, but the maths on that are disputed, to say the least. It is not sufficient to say to deal with this properly it will cost £600 billion, but to deal with tinkering around the edges will cost hardly anything on the side, and pretend both of those are fair options to choose from. We need a much bolder approach to where this comes from. That is honesty and clarity rather than threats about bills, about how this works. But also looking at where we need to get to in terms of building trust with the public again, because they are very concerned. And I share the Minister's concern about fake news online, and I don't want to see wildly inaccurate claims, which means large figures like that need to be backed up with clear evidence. I've tabled a parliamentary question to ask the Minister where that working out came from, and I hope that she'll be able to confirm that in due course. But what Labour wants to see, in just one moment, what Labour wants to see is a stronger amendment. The amendment that the Minister has cited, being tabled in lieu to the Duke of Wellington's amendment, is confined to storm overflows and not the sewage system as a whole. And that's a really important point. There's no specific duty on Ofwat or the Environment Agency to ensure compliance, and there should be. And we need to have a focus on reduction in harm rather than just adverse impacts. Now, this looks like looking busy without making a real difference. And that's why I want to set out 3 things that I hope the Minister will be able to confirm today that could make a difference. But I'll give away just before I do that.
Very grateful. We all want to clean up the rivers. Could he give us some idea of timetable and costs that he thinks would be appropriate?
Well, funny enough, that's actually one of my points I'm going to refer to the Minister on, this one here, because actually there's no timetable on this, and that I think is a really glaring hole in what has been published today. Progressive reductions in discharges sounds all well and good, but I would like to progressively reduce the amount of cake I eat. But if I do that over a day or a year, there's a big difference between the two of it, and I am a big fan of cake, as some of you may know. So let's get down to the details of what this is. There are 3 things I would like the Minister to confirm and to come to, otherwise I fear we will not be able to support her amendment today. Firstly, will she commit to reviewing the scale of the fines so that water companies that continue to routinely discharge raw sewage face higher penalties? Secondly, Labour wants to see the SPS guidance for Ofwat super strengthened so there's a clear direction to water companies to target the most polluting discharges now with a plan to address the rest urgently against a clear timeframe. Progress by DEFRA, Ofwat, the EA and water companies should have proper parliamentary scrutiny, and that should be on an annual basis, either via the EFRA committee or the EAC committee, potentially. And will the Minister set out in detail what she means by progressive reduction? And that means answering 2 very simple questions: by when and how much? If that can't be said, it's just spin. And I fear that small, tiny projects could be used by water companies to say we are meeting our progressive reduction with these 2 tiny projects over here, and not set out a clear commitment to do it. So progressively reduce discharges by when and how much.
Will you give way?
I'll keep going if I can, just because of time is under pressure on this one. This is something that's not just a concern shared by the opposition. Water UK and water companies are telling us that they have concern about the amendment and favour the Duke of Wellington's amendment, and green groups, environmental groups, angling groups, fishing groups and swimming groups saying that they also favour the Duke of Wellington's amendment over the compromise amendments. So there is widespread concern about this one here. And I think there's an important bit. This should be a lesson to Tory backbenchers on this one here, because with the sewage vote and what happened last week on parliamentary standards and corruption, I think it's now a brave backbencher on the Tory side that listens to their whips on unpopular votes. Because after dragging their MPs into the gutter, they're likely to U-turn in a week's time and make you look foolish, and make the MPs who voted look foolish. But let's also be clear that the agency that each Member of Parliament has on this, the vote last time on sewage was a disaster for the reputation of many members in this House. They knew what they were doing. They were putting the party whip ahead of the environment, and voters will judge them on that. Doing it once was a mistake. Doing it twice is a pattern that voters will recognise and vote accordingly on next time round. That's why it is vital that we rebuild trust on this issue. I think the sewage scandal has been a shameful episode for the government, and there is a real desire on a cross-party basis to make this stronger. So I'd be grateful if the Minister could set out whether she would support those 3 elements that I just outlined, so we can support it. If we don't get that reassurance, I'm afraid we can't. Very briefly, Madam Speaker, on the Office of Environmental Protection, instead of a lapdog, Labour wants to see the OEP made into a strong, robustly independent watchdog. The Minister has tried to put reassurances on the record that they will not seek to frustrate the OEP if it needs to hold government ministers to account and take enforcement action against ministers. But we have seen exactly what happens when the rules no longer suit government in the last week. And that is why we want to see those rules put into the bill. not just a statement at the dispatch box, which may be used in the future in court cases or may not be used in court cases, but clearly in this bill. And I think having regard to the guidance is welcome that she set out, but the budget setting powers and the experience of the Electoral Commission, with ministers threatening a public body if they are on receipt of bad news from it in another investigation, is a bad precedent that needs to be removed from this area here. So we want this bill to be better than it is. There are some good things in the Environment Bill, but on the whole, it's just a bit meh. It doesn't reach the scale of the action we need for the scale of the crisis that we are facing. And that's why I'd be grateful if the Minister could set out whether she would support those three things. If not, I'm afraid Labour will not be able to support her compromise amendments on sewage and will be voting against it, so we can secure a vote on the Duke of Wellington's amendment, which is far superior. Thank you.
Philip Dunn.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very conscious of time, so I will be brief. I rise to